Reciban un caluroso saludo.
Welcome and have a big hello in the name of Alianza Americas de Cristosal. My name is Janina Alias. I'm the National Campaign Manager of Alianza Americas. We are glad that you've decided to join us at this moment to discuss the abuse of power through public security policies recently implemented in Central America and their impact on human rights. The frequent use of a state of emergency to address security problems or social unrest has been a trend in these countries. What rights are most commonly violated? We'd like to give a special thanks. We're going to dive deeper into this question to that space. For this, we have a panel from 3 experts that will be joining us. I'm going to share who they are real briefly. We have Sandra Navas, who is currently head of law and security at Cristosal. She worked for several years in the Human Rights Ombudsman Office in civil society organizations. She has also served as Inspector General of the National Civil Police and Executive Director of the National Council for Children and Adolescents, among other positions. She's a graduate of the University of El Salvador, and she holds a master's degree in public administration, justice, and security from the University Institute of Ortega and Gasset Research in Spain. Our second panelist will be Abraham Abrego, who is a lawyer with more than 20 years of experience in human rights, constitutional law, strategic litigation, and anti-corruption. Currently, he is the director of Cristosal's strategic litigation program. He is passionate about contributing to the learning of younger human rights defenders. He holds a diploma on the use of inter-American human rights system from St. Paul University in Chicago. He was also one of the founding members of the first anti-corruption organization in El Salvador. Finally, we have David Morales, who is a lawyer with 34 years of experience in the defense of human rights. He is currently the head of transitional justice at Cristosal. During 2013 to 2016, he was the attorney for the defense of human rights in El Salvador. He has also been a plaintiff in the El Mozote case, which is the worst massacre perpetrated by the army in the country. We have structured the seminar around 4 questions, from which we would like to remind the attendees that you get to ask questions in the chat or in the Q&A sections available on Zoom. Before we begin, giving the floor to each one of the panelists, I would like to express our appreciation to Cristosal and also our allied organizations, WOLA and Latin America Working Group, for allowing us to collaborate and bring this conversation to you. We will begin with the first question for Abraham Abrego. In Central America, we see similar practices of authoritarianism and state violence. What patterns of abuse of power and state violence do you identify in the countries of the northern region where you work? Thank you. Good day. Thank you to Alianza Americas for the possibility to participate in this event. I would like to answer this question, but maybe I would like to give first an introduction, if we can go to the presentation. Regarding the context that characterizes our countries in the northern region, we can see that we are countries that we've lived a context, similar historical context, and we have common issues. Some of them are structural, that haven't been able to be overcome by the governments, but we see in the last year some traits, some different traits, particularly in some contexts and levels of the exercise of authoritarianism and state violence. Guatemala and El Salvador, for example, we observe a more important context of democratic regression and political persecution in the last years. As we'll see in Honduras, a bit more of a political stability and spaces of dialogue. but they still have some issues similar to the other countries. In that regard, we have identified in regards to these factors that we'll be mentioning that have had an effect in more important exercise of authoritarianism in there's a democratic regression in the institutionality of the countries. We observe this more prevalent in Guatemala and El Salvador. Honduras has had another level of transition, but we also observe an instrumentalization of justice with political motivations, which makes it to be an increase of state violence. And another factor is in all three countries, there have been conditions of criminality that have been very important at the level of gangs and organized crime. And state entities haven't given more answer than any other answers than repression. They've used these ways of punitive policies and not integrated policies, which is another factor. The other factor that we've identified as well is the reiterated use of emergency powers that will have given more faculties, mainly at the level of the police and military, and that has increased state violence. Next, please. With this, I would like to refer to the three patterns that we have identified from this monitoring that we've done as Cristosal, mainly in the last 2 years. Abuse of the punitive exercise of the state and the exercise of the state power to pursue criminality and in the framework of the use of emergency. This is a pattern that I will be referring to later on. And we've also seen an increase of violence against communities that are in conditions of marginality, being marginalized, indigenous communities that are defending ancestral property. That's the other part. We identified the three countries where different practices of state violence. Finally, the increase in all three countries of violence against human rights defenders, particularly the persecution against judicial operators, more visible in Guatemala and El Salvador. In regards to the use of powers of emergency and the exercise of punitive power in the state, it calls us that when we review the decrees that have been emitted by the three countries from July 2021 to May 2023, there have been 12 decrees that we've analyzed that are suspending rights. We can identify that these governments, they are using emergency powers in a reiterated manner. El Salvador is the one that has the largest number of rights, suspending rights, with 360, followed by Guatemala, and then Honduras. In El Salvador, in the case of Honduras, Guatemala, in some parts of the territory, meaning that either the whole population of the country or some part of the population have had their rights suspended at least for a year or the half of a year. Next, we observe that the use of emergency powers and the causes that have originated this use as a regime of exception or states of exception that suspend rights has been for reasons of security. That not necessarily the reasons of security are a valid cause from the legal standpoint for the use of regime of exception or states of exception. However, it's the same main cause that we identify. We're talking that these regimes have suspended rights and among these populations, and we're talking about right to freedom, to illegal detention, being detained through legal ways. This is a situation of governments that are exercising their power through exception and not through ordinary mechanisms. Next. And the other pattern with communities that we observe, this is a historical fact that has happened in these countries, in Guatemala and Honduras, more towards indigenous population, in communities in marginalized communities in El Salvador. That has been historical, but we've seen in the last years an increase in practices of state violence from state authorities, whereas the participation of judicial powers, police or military, where we criminalize community leaders, and particularly with the end to extract resources, natural resources from the territory or conflicts of land. This is something that is very concerning that we see it more often in the last years. There are two examples in Estor Izabal in Guatemala their historic conflict that has been going on for years, and in the case of the Garifuna communities in Honduras. Next, please. Finally, when it comes to risk for human rights defenders, we're seeing practices that are more reiterated the violations against human rights defenders, journalists, and operators, legal operators. We're talking in the case of only in Guatemala and Honduras, for example. Honduras has the 4th place worldwide according to the statistics that existed of the country with the most risk against human rights defense, whereas in Guatemala and the CIDH, they were in 5th place. In this graph, the increase of attacks in the case of Guatemala between 2019 to current times. And this is a constant that we're also seeing in the other countries. I'm going to stop my participation here, and then we can go deeper in the next stage. Thank you, Abraham. Saira, over to you. Recently, Cristosal presented a report on a year of exceptional regime that records torture practices and an investigation of deaths in state custody in El Salvador. What have been the main findings of that research? Thank you. Thank you very much to everyone that are joining us. Cristosal conducted a report, actually has systematized their reports from 1 year of the regime of exception. This is our 5th report, actually, on the regime of exception that we've called a permanent measure of repression and violation of human rights. Next, please. According to the data obtained, here I'm going to separate detentions from the first year of the regime with those detentions until now. To the first year, there were 12. Yesterday, we have 16th. Since things extension and up to the date, we have 71,479 people that have been detained. Cristosal had the same, that received 3,275 reports, and now we're in over 3,400 reports. Our main research stems from the testimony from the family members of the people that have died under custody of the state, individuals that have been detained in the different prisons of the country, the investigation of the deaths from and also audiovisual documentation from the Institute of Legal Medicine, but also obtained through family members and other individuals, including funeral homes, monitoring media outlets, and also consultations to specialists. Let's move on. It's important to say that the regime of exception, as it was highlighted by Abraham, is part of a policy of state, of a tool of a public policy of the state in the face of the absence of comprehensive policies for security, prevention, investigation of the crime, and social reinsertion. We have also identified the alteration of statistics and hiding numbers of homicides and other crimes such as extortion. There is an illicit negotiation between government and the gangs that has been revealed by journalist investigation and validated by the government of the United States. We can't decontextualize the results that the government presents in the face of this negotiation, which is what brought about a decrease of the homicide in the country. The regime of exception happens in the framework of a strategy of punitive populism and government propaganda that is very costly, that has at its service media, national media outlets, social media, and people, content generators in favor of the government, for which a figure of regime of exception is, for the moment, the only public policy tool that the government has currently. What are the patterns, and this responds to the question that you asked us, in regards to violations to human rights that we've identified? When it comes to violation to the right to freedom, there is a large number of arbitrary detentions. Not to say that they're all arbitrary and without previous investigation. We have detention due to a double judgment, stigmatization because of people wearing tattoos, whether they're elusive or not, gangs. Within the prisons, we have identified tortures, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. Particularly, there is extreme overcrowding of 35,000 people that are in prison that Salvador had prior to April 2022. We've adding the 75,000 almost people. We are the country with the largest number of people detained in the country, in the world. The conditions are inhumane and degrading. There's a lack of food and water for the consumption of those that are in prison, that are detained. Maybe half a glass of water every 2 days. They're undignified and inhumane conditions for cleanliness and also beatings, punishment, torture practices, or the use of electric shock, use of pepper gas, and other ways of torture, such as punishment through total lockdown for days or hours without medical care. Cristosal conducted an investigation on the violent deaths of people that were detained during the regime of exception. Our investigation that took as a basis testimony and verification from acts from the Institute of Legal Medicine, interviews, photographs, etc. It allowed us to document 139 individuals that died under the custody of the state in the first year, meaning until 27th of March 2022. But 4 of them were women and 135 men. However, to this date, we have 154 people that have died under state's custody, which means that these deaths are growing. And we are sorry about the last declarations from the national prosecutor that filed 142 deaths under the custody of the state, because according to the investigation, there wasn't a responsibility in these cases. So let's move forward. Forward, please. It's important to determine that the range of ages of the people that have perished under state custody is mostly young. These are individuals and productive age that are between 18 and 48 years of age. And their majority until 38 years of age, it's 40.5%. Let's move forward. As you may see in this graph, most of the people that died are people that are in an economic condition of poverty. Most of them dedicated to being informal trade sellers or tradespeople, such as carpenters. They are working on the daily in the fields. Some of them are fishers, cab drivers, and some of them students. Cristosal classified these deaths as violent deaths, likely that violent deaths, natural pathological deaths, but in this case, it's under the responsibility of the state because of the duty of medical assistance, death that is suspicious criminality, qualified to develop those that don't have any explanations. For example, cases of a person of 20 years old, which causes established as sudden death. And there are other cases without data on the cause of death. In this case, it's important to say that the people that have perished used to be victims of gangs, meaning that they were extorted, threatened, or they had a family member that was murdered or were extorted. Now they are victims of the state. Sometimes their detention happened due to harassment and conflict with police officers. The deaths have also happened due to lack of medicine or medical assistance. And there are deaths before or during the transfer to a healthcare center or a hospital center. Something that is very concerning is that the state doesn't inform the family on the situation, the health situation of the person that is detained, and also their death. It's mostly the funeral homes that wants to report this to the family members about the death of their family member. There is an important number of people that are imprisoned that were buried in common pits. It's important to say that these patterns that have allowed us to identify that these deaths happen due to torture, cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment because the bodies had lacerations, hematomes, that it would give evidence to beatings, and also with object of strangling, choking, and other signs of torture, such as electrical shock. It's important to say that some of the reports from the Legal Medicine Institute consign as cause of death strangling or mechanic asphyxiation. In some cases, it's important the correlation of the cause of death that the Institute of Legal Medicine gives does not correspond to the evidence that the body presents. They're not congruent. For example, in the case of a young man about 23 years old that perished April 18, 2022, the body clearly presented signals of beatings in multiple parts of the body. There were broken bones in the hands and feet. There were blisters and the clear evidence that he had been tortured. The body was delivered to the family by the legal medicine in a closed casket. However, there were pictures that were obtained from the body that showed what it was referred previously. I would like to announce for those that are looking at see this presentation that will now be presenting some images that are pretty sensitive and hard, but that give evidence to torture and even gunshots in some of the bodies. For example, in this case, this is an person that the Institute of Legal Medicine didn't determine that it had a gunshot, and clearly we can identify that there has been a orifice with meaning that he was shot from far. This is the case of the person that we showed that had presented different types of torture in their left hand. We can see that he was probably hung and beaten in multiple parts of the body. Let's move forward. This is a young person that died in a grave condition because he had been hit at the stomach, but also presented a condition, a critical condition of malnutrition. And it's important, and with this I'm going to close, that women and girls, boys and adolescents in the LGBTQI population, that note that they are suffering the main impacts of the regime, with documented cases of boys, girls, and adolescents that have been victims of sexual abuse and harassment from police officers and soldiers because they are alone. Many women that are detained were pregnant when they were detained, and they've given birth without their family knowing. It's sad to see that there have been 2 babies that have perished days after they were given to families, meaning they were born when they were with the families once they were detained, and their condition, or they got sick while in prison, and they have passed. Many women see their life condition affected, and there's an assignation of tasks that go beyond those that are assigned to women in the patriarchal roles that we have. In this context, both police officers as well as members from armed forces have had or have used the regime of exception to be more impune, to act with extreme abuse against LGBTQI plus community. Let's move forward. Finally, here there's an example of the deaths that Cristosal published the list with the specific data from the people that perished during the first year regime of exception. This is an open research. We hope to do a second publication to ensure the right to information and the truth. Thank you very much, Saida, for this report that is extremely concerning. We would like to thank you we'd like to thank the leadership from Cristosal and give them visibility to all of this story, especially to dignify the right to having the opportunity to report of all of these crimes. While you were presenting, and remember the song from Ruben Rosales from Plantation Inside, that you perish after a beating is normal, but this is typified as a natural cause. So we'd like to invite our participants to please share your questions in using the Q&A function or the chat function. After the intervention from our last panelist, David Morales will be opening the floor so that all our panelists could answer to your questions. We would like to continue now with David. How is the judicial system and human rights defense institutions working in this context? All right, thank you very much. The justice system in El Salvador, as a system of control in the face of these types of abuses, isn't currently working. They're not exercising their role fundamentally because they have been limited by the executive power and they don't have a proper independence. This is the report shows, which establishes a policy of torture, a policy of arbitrary detentions, tens of thousands of people. And we have the question arises, how is it possible that this can happen in today's El Salvador? How is it possible that after 30 years with democratic standards, minimum democratic standards, now we have a scenario that a massive violation to human rights? Many of these are international crimes. This is possible because we stopped the division of powers in the state of law, the rule of law. I'm not going to stop, but I'm going to bring it to play. The officialism, the government obtains an assembly that is in the likes of their thought, but once this power has been consolidated, basically judicial independence was dismantled. We established Supreme Courts that were in the lines of the presidency, and also we fired the the Attorney General. There was a reforms to decrees that would allow to have a judicial purging of judges to put in those seats, to put judges that were aligned with the current administration. So this brings a Supreme Court of Justice that is submitted to the presidency, that has become an accomplice in the development and the application of the regime of exception and its unconstitutional extension. There isn't a control of the constitutional room on the extension of the regime, for which the court is playing a role of tolerance in the face of this abuse. The Legislative Assembly, most of them officialists, they have reformed the penal laws, multiple laws, but one law that has been submitted particularly to reform is the law against organized crime, the special law against organized crime, which is the one that has been utilized to ventilate the tens of thousands of cases, people that have been detained under this regime of exception. These reforms are also make it so that these cases that are brought forward by the application of the regime, they are brought forward without due process, without guaranteeing the defense, the communication with lawyers, without guaranteeing judiciary controls and allowing abuses in the prosecutor's practices. For this reason, the extension of the regime and unconstitutional practices that are illegal of judges and prosecutors that have been appointed by arbitrarily have made it that there's a generalized torture and arbitrary detentions, among other abuses. If we go to the next slide, this practice, the General Prosecutor's Office, as I said, they're not independent from the presidency of the Republic. They're abusing their discretionality. They're presenting all of the cases, tens of thousands, under the application of the regime in the specialized jurisdiction of organized crime. And the Supreme Court of Justice at the same time has designated, without following the process established by the law, to name judges to public officers under this jurisdiction in the courts of organized crimes, which are judges without faces. We can't know their identity or how they were appointed, and these judges are receiving all of the cases from the regime of exception, and they are decreeing the provisional detentions in automatic, even if the cases don't have proof or indications. They are violating the right to defense, and they are submitting people basically to an undefined detention that could go, according to the reforms approved by the Assembly, up to 2 years. So the people that have detained under the regime will not be facing ordinary judges, but a body of judges that has been appointed by the court. These are judges of exception, judges ad hoc for the regime, for the application of the regime, and these judges and make sure to not exercise any control on the abuse. And this is expressly forbidden by the Constitution. If we go to the next slide, this generates having people that are detained under the regime, and as it was explained, they're detained arbitrarily in conditions of torture and complete lack of communication with family members or lawyers, not even with organisms from human rights. These people haven't been able to exercise their right to have a hearing where proofs are presented. The judges from exception extend the detention up till 2 years. That is why we don't have any cases that have reached the phase of ruling. They're all in the stage of investigation. And after 2 years, they may be facing sentences from 20 to 45 years. We're talking about thousands of people submitted to torture, arbitrary detention, dying due to these conditions without having an independent judge, an independent prosecutor's office that could control these abuses, and that also they can't exercise their defense. I'm would stop my presentation here to give floor to the space for dialogue. Thank you very much, David. We have a last question for Abraham, and we have a lot of questions coming in from the audience. Abraham, from your perspective, what could be some effective recommendations to confront repression and abuse of power in Northern Central America? Well, first of all, it's important the citizen participation in reporting of these types of human rights violations. Maybe these types of reports that we're sharing in the case of El Salvador hadn't been possible if people wouldn't present the reports of violations to counteract that in official information that isn't good. Obviously, what is needed here is that those countries where, for example, they are implementing regimes of exception, they know this information to avoid continuing these recurring practices of the use of exception, because we see clearly what is the cause. Following this route of repressive security policies and not really integral or security policies where there's a citizen participation, it becomes really important. So the recommendation that we've made here to the countries, for example, they should stop extending these sorts of regimes. The other thing that we believe that is important is to strengthen institutional mechanisms of the defense of human rights. In these cases of repression and the punitive exercise of the state, the subtopic of institutionality is important. When institutionality is weak, hardly the population will have the possibility to protect their rights. So the mechanisms that may exist in the countries or the legislation that exists in the protection of human rights must be strengthened. And then the other side, we are insisting that it's necessary to strengthen particularly those mechanisms of human rights and the protection of indigenous population, for example, in Guatemala and Honduras, and respecting the rights of property and ancestral property, they have generated conflict and attacks against them. In the case of El Salvador, we're seeing that the conditions of poverty and marginalization of a large number of the population requires policies that are repressive. That is in general terms what I believe that should be recommended. Thank you. Thank you, Abraham. We will now try to use these last minutes of the conversation, the other half of the conversation. The first question we have from the audience, from Jessica Garcia, is what should be the next step from the government of El Salvador in face of this regime of exception? And it can be taken by anyone from the panelists. You can just raise your hand and go ahead and answer the question. Well, I would like to also answer a second question I saw in the chat regarding this clandestine pits. It's really important what Abraham was explaining, which is that the regime of exception is part of a policy, a repressive policy from the government, from the President Bukele, that is linked to staying in power, to guaranteeing his stay in power and becoming, of course, an authoritarian regime, a dictatorship. The regime of exception is a method of punitive populism from civil society organizations that were directly providing services to the victims, that we are advocating, documenting, and also trying to look for justice for the victims. We are also denouncing internally and externally that all of these messages that exist from the government of Bukele, they're not true. In Latin America and also outside of the Americas, we have the idea that the regime of the Bukele regime, that this model of punitive populism can give solutions to the issues of security, which isn't true. And it's really important, the work that is done of disseminating this and denouncing this, and also activating the international systems of protection to human rights, both the inter-American system as well as the United Nations system. Maybe my colleagues could give additional information, but I saw there was a question regarding clandestine pits. I would like to say that these is a recurrent report that these clandestine pits exist from before. It was a practice from gangs, but also organized crime. And now we are seeing, or we're receiving, an important number of reports of people that were imprisoned, that were detained, that lived the tortures and did inhumane treatment within the prisons, and that they saw when people were buried within the prisons, or they left the prisons dead, and that there's no information that's provided about this. This not only allows to presume, but also there are people that have given information that these pits exist. To this moment, we have yet to document or investigate the specific place where they're located. However, it's a very important step that needs to be taken, and the challenge is from the Salvadorian authorities. Sadly, we have a general prosecutor that is in the line of the government, and that will cover any type of investigation in this regard. There are these, it's like these exist, but it's likely that at this moment we'll be able to document them, but citizen reporting is very important to guarantee justice for the victims. Thank you. Thank you. Also, when the clandestine pits happened during the war, that has taken decades to try to get to the truth of these facts. So it's important to be vigilant in these actions of reporting. There's another question, which is what type of answers or reactions is Cristosal receiving from representatives from the state, from representatives of the government, but because from the work they're doing. And the question is open for any of our three panelists. David, I don't know if you want to go ahead and take it. There is a practice that is part of the policy of propaganda from the government, which is permanent harassment to people that are human rights defenders against human rights organizations and also journalists or independent media outlets. The punitive populism that is being applied by the regime for President Bukele is an authoritarian populism willing to even generate massive violations to human rights. And that measure, the voices that denounce violations, the investigations that show corruption, abuse of power are uncomfortable. So not only are they directed towards Cristosal that official discourse. For example, in the case of the Minister of Secretary of Security, Gustavo Toro, is a visceral discourse where basically they call the organizations as emissaries of evil, among others. The discourse, the defamatory discourse, they want to associate the work of the defense of human rights to the defense of gangbangers. But besides from this officialist discourse, using the media outlets, radio and television, there's also a parallel apparatus through social media of troll accounts, of fake accounts, or with bots with real identities that dedicate their time to threaten, assault, and this machinery of harassment and has a misogynistic way of operating. When there's women who are human rights defenders, including colleagues from Cristosal, the message of threat is exacerbated. But evidently, it's a work of articulated harassment. A representative from New Idea with New Ideas or a ministry in the government is not even the president that has even insulted the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights for the shame of the country through his Twitter account. Once they launch this message, the parallel structure in social media of trolls and bots, which are defamatory spokesperson, activate to generate massive attacks. Obviously, of course, there's some harassment that come in from institutionally through institutions such as governance, which is or homeland, which is the one that is overseeing the work of organizations from civil society. The government apparatus is working in this way, and evidently the accumulation of power could generate the exacerbation of this, and it can get to more severe levels. Thank you, David. Saira or Abraham, would you like to add something else to David's answer? All right, so we have a question from a colleague, Aaron Rocha. He says, the question is, what is the strategy to follow in international fora and multilateral fora? We have seen manifestations of concern and interest from governments and organisms such as the Organization of American States. How can we support it from civil society outside of the country or overseas? Yes, so I think that particularly in contexts that are such unfavorable, as is the case of El Salvador, as David and Sada started to represent it, that there are reiterated attacks. I think that international solidarity, both from international organisms as well as civil society in other countries, is very important. Especially in contexts where we're trying to replicate as a successful model what's happening in El Salvador. So I think that that articulation with civil society in other regions, particularly in Central America, and also articulating organized responses to the type of policies or human rights violations as they are happening is very important. In this case, for example, in the case of documenting human rights violations, informing on the outside what is happening is also very important, but also the support and this humanitarian support that can be articulated towards the victims that are suffering from this abuse, because we're having it's humanitarian crisis. The number of the people that have been detained, many of them are innocent, and the effect that this is having also in their family. Thank you, Abraham. We have an additional question from Roberto Calderon. In the research that was conducted by Cristosal, the research, have you considered a sub-registry of all of those cases that have been given visibility? Yes, thank you. Of course. What we have presented is we've been able to make sure that it happened. We make sure that these 71,400 people that have been detained have been so arbitrarily, that on the one side. When in regards to the deaths that we denounced, that many of the cases, people may have been buried in clandestine pits. Their family members haven't been notified about their death. There are many people that still have condition of detained that are disappeared, and likely people that have passed due to a regime of exception. Their family members don't know in what prison they are in. They haven't been able to visit them, and the state does not provide information. They don't even have a registry, a formal registry where the person could consult it, where their family member is detained, the order of which judge the person is. There is a sub-registry that is concerning, that is severe. Every time that we present reports of this type, or that any organization presents public reports, or the reports and the different organizations grow, and there are people that come to organizations, but they ask to remain anonymous. It's understandable because the situation of the regime, it means that if there's a person that reports that they are at risk to be detained, or someone that is looking for justice, and they have someone that have been detained, may have as a consequence that this person that is detained will remain there for many years. So the reforms that were approved last night are very concerning, and that are related to the fact that the proof that will be required to condemn or process these people that have yet to be processed actually don't have the value that the criminal process requires. There is an important sub-registry that is concerning of detentions, but also from the deaths and also vulnerations to the due process. Thank you. Abraham and David, would you like to add additional elements to Saira's answer?
Bueno, tenemos una pregunta
Okay,
más.
so we have an additional question. Let me see here, because we've gotten a lot of questions.
Algo que tiene que ver también.
Something that also has to do, you mentioned troll accounts, but also the use of technology for espionage for organizations, media outlets, mainly that are consistently denouncing things and trying to make the truth accessible to the people. The question that is made by one of our participants is, what knowledge do you have of the use of these types of technologies against citizens that may not be criminals? Maybe we have to put in perspective the use of a technology against individuals that are actively concerned for the state of the violation of human rights, violation to the freedom of press, and of course, respect of dignity and the life of the Salvadorian people. Yes, we have identified the use of technology, so the Pegasus software, which is a very expensive software with indication that the Salvadorian state has purchased it. This was shared by the company, but apparently was used for the espionage of journalists and NGO members. Actually, our director was part of that. Part of those interventions from Pegasus. There's a use of other software and technology. We must add to this that there have been legal reforms that have been made in the sense that in the law of communications to integrate even figures such as digital covered witnesses that allow that from the use of digital information, and this can be used in legal proceedings against individuals. So in a way, we are formalizing this type of practices, and it has been proven that they are being used. Yes, this issue brings us directly to another authoritarian policy, anti-democratic policy in the current Salvadoran regime, which is a policy of opacity, totally nullifying the right to public information access. Cristosal tried to pursue an investigation from the public funding that was used to implement Pegasus with the ends to spy on independent journalists and people from civil society and also our human rights organizations. And this suit was rejected. The investigation wasn't conducted. What happens in El Salvador, what's happening in El Salvador is that since the arrival of the government, of the President Bukele, systematically, all of the government institutions have been hindering the right of public to access to public information. Public information is seen as reserved according to resolutions that are evidently arbitrary from the different government entities. And also, for the presidency controlled the Institute of Access to Public Information. As I said, they did the same thing with the Supreme Court of Justice, but also with the Court for the Defense of Human Rights, which previous holder and the current holder don't exercise or activate their actions, their roles to ensure their role of oversight, and information is limited. This is particularly grave in the large numbers of reports of violations from the current administration. On the case of CCS, which is a campaign promise from President Bukele, but when CCS, even with its limited capability, gave the national prosecutors 12 cases of corruption attributed to officers from the Bukele. After the response from Bukele, for the President Bukele, was to close the CCS and also firing the Attorney General. And this is clearly demonstrated today, and it has been pointed out by the prosecutor's office from the District East and New York, and the case against 13 leaders of the MS gang has shown proof of these negotiations, and a pact was reached to give election support during the past elections at a legislative and municipal level, and also the decrease of homicides. The propaganda apparatus from Bukele, as Saida said, is very powerful at a national level, but also they're investing a lot at international level. We don't know how much, because that information is also reserved, how much they use in propaganda. They have managed to place the sympathy in some countries in the region, and also particularly in other politicians and public officers that are also promoting punitive populisms that are from other regions of the continent and trying to take an image of efficiency, that through the regime of exception, there has been a decrease of homicide and controlled criminality. This is very much in doubt. What may seem to really be the cause of the decrease of homicide from the Bukele negotiation, the government with high leaders of the gangs that are being reflected now to the protection that the Bukele Supreme Court gives to gang leaders, which extradition has been requested by the United States, and that the Supreme Court of El Salvador is currently blocking these extraditions. David, that answer that just provided in perspective for those that are joining you from the United States or places where people are looking for asylums or fleeing conditions where their lives have been put in vulnerability, has great relevance. Access to information, access to truth, access to documents that could effectively show that these people are fleeing from conditions that if they are returned, their lives may be in danger. I'm going to give the floor to Saida, that I know she also would like to share additional thoughts on the international support that the Bukele administration is having, and also the answer regarding this CIDH. So basically, there's a few questions related on to why this popularity from Bukele and who supports the regime of exception. We must say that even with the public denouncing and the grave violations to human rights that are committed on the daily in this country, and the level of debt that El Salvador has, which is the highest that we've ever had, we have indebted basically all of our GDP. They continue to receive loans from international banks, from also international organisms, while the regime, such as in the case of El Salvador, continues to receive economic support, they will continue to finance or fund these type of practices that violate human rights and that attempt also against the economy of the country as well as the development. So it's really important. There was also a question on what could be done from from human rights organizations from in other countries. It's disseminating what's happening in the country, because as we've talked about this in this forum, the apparatus of propaganda apparatus Bukele, that is over 1,000 media outlets to reproduce it on social media, TV and radio, is very big. And this makes it that the populations in the region believe this discourse, but also that there are politicians that are trying to imitate this model and also quoting Bukele as a world reference. And on the other side, when it comes to international organisms, I would like to say that human rights organizations, we currently go to the Inter-American Commission. Actually, this next Friday in the morning, we're going to have a hearing with the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights regarding the conditions in the prisons and the situation of human rights defenders as well as journalists. It's really important that we disseminate, that we share the truth, the real information, and that each organization in the country where they're at, they can try to explain and try to give a dimension of what's happening in El Salvador. Finally, someone was asking about habeas corpus. Let me tell you that multiple organizations were presented hundreds of habeas corpus, and sadly, this court that has been imposed that is unconstitutional hasn't even responded to the habeas corpus. And they continue to be in impunity, and they guarantee the impunity of the regime of exception. Thank you very much. Thank you, Saida. And with your answer, we're reaching the end of this conversation, not without mentioning previously to our audience that the link to the report that was presented today by our colleagues in Cristosal will be shared together with the recording of this webinar. We would like to thank again the participation of Saida, Abraham, David, and also the collaboration with Cristosal, our allied organizations, Latin American Working Group, and WOLA, for allowing us to bring to you this conversation. There have been a large number of questions that we received. Some of them we've tried to make sure that your comments and questions reach this moment. The last comment that I saw there is that this history is repeating. Not only this also happened in Salvador years back. So what we are seeing now doesn't come from a void. There's definitely a history that is extremely concerning of human rights violations in El Salvador, in Guatemala, in Honduras, and Nicaragua. We would like to invite you to continue working. That the hope of the denouncing this and working together, believing in these fora where we can make justice, and especially the dignity of those that are being violated against by these processes of authoritarianism, violence, and sadly, much darkness isn't what will prevail, but the effort that we are putting in daily each and every one of us in the different fora that we're part of. We would like to thank you for all of the work that much courage and that Cristosal is doing through this report that is very important, that it will be used surely by many of the people that are joining us for this conversation. Again, thank you very much, and also an appreciation from my colleague Jesus Contreras, who was here to facilitate this conversation, but she wasn't feeling well, so we hope she feels better. Again, thank you very much, David, Sarah, Abraham, for this excellent conversation. May you have a great day. Good day. Thank you very much.